Good evening. Welcome to all of you. We are thrilled to welcome you this evening for a very special conversation with Priya Parker, and also to celebrate our first ever alumna gathering of Iron Sharpening Iron. So wonderful to see so many of you here, alumni of all of our programs, the Executive Certificate Program, some from our virtual Leadership Development Seminar, and some from our ISI for PTS seminar as well. So wonderful to have all of you here. I am Ann Stewart. I serve here as Executive Vice President at Princeton Seminary and also the founding director of Iron Sharpening Iron alongside my fabulous colleague, Thais Carter. Before we launch the conversation with Priya Parker this evening, I want to take just a few minutes to talk about what brings us together this evening and what we are celebrating as we gather to mark this 5-year celebration. Because it has everything to do with the reasons of why it is that we gather. The gathering tonight actually has its origin in another gathering, which happened in this room. In 2018, a group of leaders gathered here in this very space with a vision and an idea to build something that we had not yet seen, an executive leadership program specifically for women clergy that takes pastors seriously as leaders, equipping them with the confidence that comes from competence in the art and science of leading well, with a vision for the flourishing of the whole church. We gathered because we knew the statistics about the lack of gender equality in the church, and you know them too. The most recent National Congregations survey says that only 14% of congregations in the United States are led by a woman head of staff. And moreover, only 8% of congregants in the United States have the experience of attending a religious community with a woman head of staff. Now, you know that's a problem for the church and for society, not only because the leadership of women clergy has been linked to higher levels of trust and engagement in congregations, but also because it has a powerful influence beyond the church. A recent study of women's ordination in America by Cami Bolin and Benjamin Knoll, which was published by Oxford University Press just a few years ago, found that having an influential female religious leader in one's youth had a lasting impact on levels of self-esteem, self-efficacy, and education, which in turn was linked to higher levels of employment, income, and leadership in adulthood. They found that women who reported being influenced by a woman religious leader in their youth are today, as adults, productively employed at rates equal to men. Their research concludes that gender equality in religious congregational leadership is a necessary precondition for gender equality in society at large. Think about that for a moment. So we gathered that day in 2018, and we gather today because we know the leadership of gifted women is vital for the flourishing of the church and for the world. So we gathered that day in 2018 to dream together. And that gathering included some of the people who are here tonight. Lori Ferguson was there that day. Sarah Butter was there that day. Pam Drizel was there that day. Dale Rounds was there that day. And the Holy Spirit, she was there too. That gathering led to a grant proposal and a major gift from the Lilly Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, for the launch of Iron Sharpening Iron, which we launched 5 years ago. That's what happens when we gather. Soon others joined us. Lois Annick and Shelley Smith joined us as coaches. Kathy Gilliard joined us as pastor in residence. Thais Carter joined us as Thais Carter. And then class by class, year by year, all of you joined us to build something together far more powerful than any one of us could do alone. 5 years later, more than 120 women have been through the ISI program and are now part of this network. The energy of all of you, dynamic, faithful, vibrant leaders, when we gather, is electric. I want you to look around tonight and see what you have been part of building. This is the power of gathering. This is what happens when we gather. No one tells the story of this impact better than Gary Vasquez, who is an ISI graduate from 2022, who had one of these powerful experiences at her first ISI seminar. And so let's listen to Gary's story. Taste makes all the magic happen, as we all know.
This is ironing, sharpening iron at its best. It was my first time there. It was our formal dinner. And I said, I have a burning question and my heart's ready to just explode. Is it okay for us to nominate ourselves? Is it okay for us to put our name in the hat? Is it okay? And just to hear a whole room of women say, yes, yes, Gary. Before I had traveled to Iron Sharpening Iron, I had had a conversation with my denomination. And I had asked about my district. I had asked, who's going to take the leadership of this district? Now, out of 67 years of ministry in this region, I am the first female presbyter elected into that position. I was in awe to see so many wonderful women in ministry having similar challenges to myself, and I came out of the program saying this is a sisterhood. When we gather, we share resources, we talk about how our days are going, we talk about our personal lives, we talk about our ministry, we talk about the challenges that we face in our congregations, but we are once again supporting each other and just giving us that space to just ask, what is it that you need? How can we pray? How can we support you? Being able to come together as one mind, one body in Christ.
Right? It's not only about you as individuals, but the people that your leadership impacts. I hear a lot about clergy burnout these days, but that is not the story that I hear from ISI graduates. You are equipped, empowered, inspired, engaged to lead. And in turn, you are equipping, empowering, inspiring others. And that has an exponential impact in the world. When you lead, people flourish. Congregations flourish. Communities flourish. That's why we gather. The purpose of our gathering is not for ourselves alone, but for the work that God calls us to do in the world, and you are doing it. And it is inspiring. We have one more word from Kathy Gilliard, one of our pastors in residence, about what she sees when she looks at this program over the last 5 years.
I've appreciated the growth of the program itself. Just like anything that is starting out, we're not always sure where it's going to go. And so I've seen the wonderful administrators and all of the work and the intention that they have set with the participants, but also with making sure that the participants have a well-rounded program with many of the various topics, with finance, with strategic planning, with conversations around vulnerability, with stories and storytelling. And so it's been great to see this emergence of this program expanding and growing. And I'm very optimistic about the future of it, where it's going to be in 5 or 10 years. It's very exciting. And the church, capital C, really needs programs like this. It's really amazing.
The church needs this, and the church needs you. This is what happens when we gather. There is a hope and a hopefulness in the power of your gathering and being together, about what you bring out in each other and about the faith that propels you. And I believe that that has a leavening impact in the world. That's why we gather. One of the fundamental convictions of our program is that we want to put pastors in conversation with leaders in a variety of different disciplines. We want to put pastors in conversation with the authors of the books that we are reading. And so I can think of no one we'd rather be in conversation with than the one who wrote the book on gathering, which is Priya Parker. Priya, welcome. Tonight we are honored to have Priya Parker with us. She has become a household name with her book, The Art of Gathering, How We Meet and Why It Matters. This book has been named a Best Book of the Year by Amazon, NPR, Financial Times, and Bloomberg, among others. Priya has devoted her career to helping leaders and communities have conversations about identity and vision at moments of transition. She is trained in the field of conflict resolution and has worked on college campuses and on peace processes in the Arab world, Southern Africa, and India. So we have a lot to learn from her today. So Priya, honored that you are here. Please join me in welcoming her. So I'm going to start with some questions to launch our conversation, but then we are also collecting questions from you on Slido. So on the papers on your seats, you'll see the link to Slido and the code. So please add your questions there, and we will be incorporating them. So Priya, so glad to have you here with us. To start us off, you begin your book in such a beautiful way by talking about your own upbringing and your own story, which has led you to this. You say in the beginning, talking about your childhood, I moved every 2 weeks between my mother's and father's households, toggling back and forth between a vegetarian, liberal, incense-filled Buddhist, Hindu, New Age universe and a meat-eating, conservative, twice-a-week church-going, evangelical Christian realm.
It's true.
So it was perhaps inevitable that I ended up in the field of conflict resolution. So Priya, tell us a little bit about your own story and how that led you to conflict resolution and to gathering.
Well, first, I'm so happy to be here with you all. It's rare. It's a real treat to walk into a room with such presence and such seriousness of purpose and clearly such a fit. So thank you for having me. Like many of you, I was born in Zimbabwe. My father is white from Iowa. Any Iowans in here? Yeah. And my mother's from India, and they met at Iowa State, and they got married, and they were each other's sources of adventure and of rebellion. And I was born in Zimbabwe because it was the closest good hospital to the village that we were living in Botswana that would accept an interracial couple at the time. And so we moved every 6 months for their work, and we moved to the Maldives, and we moved to Indonesia, and then we moved to India, and then we moved to Virginia, which is the opposite of the Maldives. And within kind of settling into Virginia, and I was in elementary school, and they were just finally kind of still. And within a year, they separated. And within 2 years, they divorced. And within 3 years, they each married other people. And people who in a lot of ways kind of reflected their original worldview. And I toggled. I thought you said toddled. I was like, I was a little older than toddling, but I toggled back and forth between these two households. And I think part of my parents had joint custody. They were committed to joint custody so that I could be raised by both. And I've heard that in divorced families now, there's a new thing where the child or the children stay in the home and the parents circle through. Have you heard about this? So like the thinking is changing, but I was not part of that generation. And basically every other week I would enter a household in which the way one begins dinner was completely different. And the assumptions that there was any other way was not necessarily a concern. In one home, of course, one would say grace before one would ever touch the food. In another, the word God was considered incredibly controversial. And I grew up in these two competing and completing households in which I was both a part of each and also apart from each, even temporally. Like 2 weeks, I was just literally not there. And so I did become a conflict resolution facilitator. And actually, Princeton has part of that story, which is I'm biracial, and I went to the University of Virginia as an undergraduate. And the first question people would ask me there is, what are you? Have any of you been asked that? So I didn't understand what the question meant at first. And then I quickly learned the code. And I was like, oh, they mean like racially. And so I learned very quickly to say, oh, I'm half white, half white American, half Indian. And UVA has a strong sense of student self-governance. And so a student said to me, an older student said, if you have a problem with race, do something about it. And I was like, little old me? It's sort of like the video, like, do I nominate myself? Like, that's what that means? And I learned about a process called sustained dialogue, actually through my mother. And the man who started it helped write the Camp David Accords. His name was Hal Saunders. And he had been in 4 different presidential administrations, and he had retired. And he was a trustee at Princeton. And I would only tell this long story because we're here, he basically realized that the processes that he used as a professional could be used for race at Princeton. And students approached him and said, please help us, we have a race problem here. And that was in 1999, and they wrote a manual, and I got my dirty little hands on that manual, and Hal Saunders and the Princeton students came to the University of Virginia and trained us, and we launched Sustained Dialogue September 10th, 2001. So a gathering, right? It wasn't we launched, meaning we wrote a letter to the community saying this is happening, but it was an invitation, and in their minds, because we launched it, it already existed. And so when this massive global crisis erupted, the container at the University of Virginia was this little thing called Sustained Dialogue. And that was sort of the beginning of my conflict resolution path.
Wow. So how did that shape what you think a gathering is and why gathering is important as a concept?
Part of my, as a facilitator, as a trainer, so much of what my peers and I learned and were trained to do is create connection for people in the room without them having to be the same. And learning how to do things like getting people off their scripts or saying something or writing a question in such a way or asking a question in such a way that somebody is so moved by what somebody else says at the table that they rip up the stump speech and they try a sprout speech. Right? They don't offer their fully baked dough, their fully baked bread, they offer their dough. And what I realized was that so much of what I thought were basic skills that facilitators were taught is not what we're taught in the public culture about gathering. If you enter a bookstore or a library and you go to the hosting section, what do you find? Cookbooks, right? The proxy of the way we host, the way we gather, the way we convene is you have to be good at shaping this thing called food. And so I wanted to demystify how do you create transformative gatherings? I don't even use the word gathering. The original title for The Art of Gathering was called Breakthrough Spaces. Have an editor. And so I went on this journey and I was like, who else in the world is gathering in transformative ways? And I interviewed over 100 people who, in all sorts of contexts, pastors, rabbis, hockey coaches, photographers who would have 10 minutes with the head of state and 19 bodyguards in the room, and what does he do minute by minute to get the shot from the head of state that the head of state does not want to give, but is actually deeply authentic in their kind of presentation. And the result was The Art of Gathering, and The Art of Gathering came out in 2018, and I don't know if you heard, but Gathering was canceled 2 years later. And it was banned, and part of what I began to see in that moment was that when gathering was taken from us, we began to see it. And we began to see it as this thing that shapes us. We began to see it, oh, this is how we wed? Right? How many of you have been to a Zoom wedding in the last 3 years? How many have officiated a Zoom wedding? Zoom funerals, right? Zoom divorces, Zoom Supreme Court cases, Zoom classrooms. And fundamentally, all of institutions, whether they're workplaces or any place else, were deconstructed into their core parts to be able to ask where and when and how and with whom do we meet and who decides. And that has been the core question across all institutions for the last 4 years.
What helps institutions, organizations, communities discern or determine what their values are then around?
Often crisis, reckonings, right? A huge part, maybe I'll just pause and just around gathering, you asked this earlier. So I define a gathering as any time 3 or more people come together for a purpose with a beginning, middle, and end. So, or another way to think about it is a gathering is a creation of a temporary alternative world. So a gathering can be a rave, it can be a Maggie Rogers concert, it can be a prayer circle, it can be a protest, it can be a classroom experience. And so much of what people we begin to realize what matters often when it's taken from us or when it's challenged. And often, current President Biden has this saying, show me your budget and I'll tell you your values. So if I, with homage to him, show me how you gather and what you gather around and who is invited and who is excluded, and I'll tell you your values.
So at that point, you have a very interesting line in the book about inclusion and exclusion. And you write, we will have begun to gather with purpose when you learn to exclude with purpose, when you learn to close doors. The thoughtful gatherer understands that inclusion can in fact be uncharitable and exclusion generous.
Are you
That
nervous?
sounds counterintuitive to me. Explain.
So you were probably raised how I was, which is with a spirit of generosity. There's always one more seat at our table. The more is the merrier. But very often, not all the time, but very often, the more is not the merrier. The more is the hairier. The more is the scarier. And there are certainly opportunities and there are certainly gatherings that absolutely benefit from size, right? The World Cup benefits from size. Maybe not mosh pits. Large concerts benefit from size. Launching a product, you want as many people there. But for many, many, many types of gatherings, meetings, birthday parties, small group contexts, we often over-include because we haven't thought about what our purpose is. We often over-include because we feel scared and we don't actually have the language to say, actually, this isn't for you this time. And the biggest mistake we make when we gather is we assume that the purpose is obvious and shared. Oh, I know what a staff meeting is. I know what a wedding is, right? Long aisle, white dress. I know what a board meeting is. Long brown table, 12 white men. Kidding. Sort of. And because we have these forms in our head, we don't pause to actually ask what is the purpose. And when we don't ask what the purpose is, we include, and by including, we actually shift the dynamics and often threaten the purpose of the meeting. So I'll give a simple example from a work example. Steve Jobs, when he left Pixar, so Pixar is a sort of like movie film company, if any of you they did Frozen 1 and Frozen 2 and Frozen 212 and Toy Story 1 and Toy Story, all of these kind of like big animations. And they were famous for their very, very highly structured, creatively brilliant kind of brainstorming creative team meeting. And it was like the secret sauce of this company. It was 18 people around this big, long table. And one of the things that they realized was as it became more and more successful, the creatives became more and more scared. And they became more shy, like worried about criticizing each other. They became less imaginative, to use your language. They just basically kind of froze. And so they designed this meeting on all of these different ways to have even the most senior people come up with stories that made them laugh, and to make everybody, no matter who they were in the hierarchy, pick apart each other's, normalize critique. So Steve Jobs comes back to Pixar after getting ceremoniously booted out years later, and he's like, I want to see this creative meeting. I was like, this is why I'm back. I want to see how the secret sauce is made. And the leader at the time, CEO, Ed Catmull, said very astutely, you can go, but it's just going to be a horse and pony show. And then we'll redo the meeting. And what he was and he was like, what do you mean? Well, people are going to be there they're going to be performing for you. And what he also deeply understood was Steve Jobs at the deepest level was about the work at the end of the day. And so in that moment, Ed Catmull practiced generous exclusion. It wasn't personal, it was purposeful. And so often, whether it's within our staff meetings, whether it's within the church, whether it's within an evening for a fundraiser, just assuming everyone's invited actually is lazy. It's generosity hiding in front of laziness. Behind, what's my metaphor? Right? Where it's just what is this for? Who are we trying to bring together? What are our gaps? Who do we need to convince? Who are we actually for in the first place? Because actually when you're about something, you begin to get to be seen. And so when you have a specific disputable purpose, you're actually creating an interesting social contract with your guests.
So tell us more about that phrase, a specific disputable purpose. What is that, and how do we know when we have
So
one?
if your purpose for your gathering is, first, if it's a form, you just we repeat old forms that may no longer serve us, whether that's a meeting you inherited from another leader, and it's like, can you just take over the Monday morning meeting? It's like, sure. And then we think we just repeat the form. Or a birthday party, again, you think pointy hats, candle, and to actually stop and to ask this question, what is a specific need in my life or in this community that by bringing together a specific group of people you might be able to address? I'll give another example outside of the church, though I think this person was a churchgoer. So in 2018, The Art of Gathering came out, and a journalist called me up, and she had been assigned to Art of Gatheringify a dinner party. And she called me up, and I said, what do you think that means? And she said, I don't know. I put the fish knife here and put wine here, serve ramps. Ramps are in season. And I said to her what I just said to you. What is a specific need in your life that by bringing together a specific group of people you might be able to address? And she scratched her head and she was like, I don't know if this counts, but I'm a journalist. I'm also a worn out mom. And the other day I was at a friend's house and she cut me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich into triangles and fed me baby carrot sticks, and I burst into tears. And I said, why did you burst into tears? And she said, because it's been a long time since I've been the one taken care of. And she said, what if I hosted a dinner party for my other worn out moms? And I said, great, give it a name. And she called it the Worn Out Moms Hootenanny. And then I said, give it a rule, give it a pop-up rule, make it more specific. And she said, if you talk about your children, you have to take a tequila shot. And she started, the life came back in her face. It was no longer an obligation. She actually had a decision-making filter. It was a specific purpose. It wasn't for everyone. It was disputable. What if I don't want to take a tequila shot? Well, then don't talk about your kids, right? Are dads invited? If they're a little bit more worn out, they could come too. What she was doing at some level was she was creating a specific disputable need. And in so doing, she found others that shared that need. And the last thing I'll say is the gathering doesn't start at the moment of entry. It starts at the moment of invitation. And so she said, how do I do this? And if they had entered and she said, you have to take a tequila shot if you talk about your kids, it'd be like, who do you think you are? So subject line in the email, worn out mom's hootenanny, right? As you think about the emails, as you think about the digital communication of who you're sending things to, what are you calling it, right? What's the title that allows people to understand what is this thing? So part of the specific disputable purpose is at the deepest level. It's need assessment. What is the need in this community? What is the need I choose to focus on? What is the new need I choose to rally people around? And then how do I get buy-in?
How do you think faith leaders and pastors might think about that question? Often when there is such pressure to, I want as many people in my church as possible, want to be as fully inclusive as possible, how might we translate some of these concepts of specific, disputable purpose to gathering people for worship or other religious community?
In Barack Obama's Dreams of My Father, he had this line that I found very interesting. It was since he went back to Kenya to kind of visit his father's family. And he had a great aunt, and his great aunt was telling him stories about his father. And she said, "You know what your father didn't understand?" And he said, "What did my father not understand?" And she said, "If everybody's family, nobody's family." And I've thought about that for a very long time as a biracial, global, cultural, open person who's moved many places. And I think at some level, like if you're for everyone, you're kind of for nobody. And when people, like a vague church is not going to be interesting. There's endless churches people can join. There's endless non-churches people can join. At some deep level, to have a very specific vision, to know who you are for first, helps you make decisions. If who you are for first, I'll give an example of an orchestra. A lot of orchestras and live music-based institutions particularly have been in crisis for 20 years. Then they were really in crisis after the pandemic, right? In-person singing, right? The biggest way to spread COVID, right, is singing, is song. And and many of these institutions for years have been in a crisis where 90% of their patrons are over the age of 60. And so there's an orchestra on the West Coast that began to realize that if we just keep saying this is for everyone, but we don't actually change any of our rituals, any of our price tags, any of the ways that we assume of what people wear to enter and who this is actually for, we're not actually saying we're for everyone. And so what they did was they started giving discounts, counterintuitive. They gave people 50 to 80% off of tickets if they wore jeans to the concert. And it both shifted who people thought the concert was for, and it shifted the behavior of their patrons. And so at some level, when you're willing as a faith leader to draw a line, to ask, and I would say to ask the questions that are on your heart, to ask the questions that are on your spirit, to ask the questions that brought you into the church, to ask the questions, you could be doing so many other things with your life. You could be living in the world with your faith as your lens, but you didn't choose to. You chose to enter the cloth. And so choose the questions. Like if I was advising you, I would sit so still and I would ask, what are the questions of your heart? And to trust that the questions of your heart will also be the questions of others, because you have deep, deep, deep knowledge and passion and proximity. And when you begin to have passion and you're enlivened by your questions, people will be enlivened by them as well.
So as you're describing what it means to be...
Sorry, can I say one more thing?
Please.
If you were a group of men, I wouldn't say that. I'm serious. If you were institutionally holding hierarchy, I wouldn't say that necessarily. So I'm saying that very specifically to this group and to this room. And maybe in 40 or 50 years, if it was 80% women in congregations, I may say, don't assume your questions are everybody's questions, right? So this is a very specific context advice.
So we'll say a little bit more about that and what it means to be a gatherer, that is the one who convenes the gathering, is a really important function and requires some courage and moral vision as you're describing it for convening. So share with us a little bit more about what does it mean to be a gatherer?
I mean, first of all, I think gathering is a verb, and small g, gathering. And I deeply believe it has to be a democratic skill. And within institutions, the role of the host or gatherer is the person or the people who have the sacred ability to line draw around who and what do we choose to collectively pay attention to, right? If we can bring together, virtually or in person, anyone around anything and help them experience that, that's a huge responsibility. And so when you think about and within most church contexts, you're also inheriting a huge and rich history of rituals. Some of them, rituals also can be oppressive. Rituals can be incredibly liberating. One book if you haven't read it already, is The Politics of Ritual, Molly Farnworth. I think it's actually out of Princeton. I think it's a Princeton University Press book. Came out 2 years ago, and she talks about ritual as a political act. So within churches, whether it's one of the, I'm a conflict resolution facilitator, one of the biggest, a pre-symptom of schism is internal fights about music. Blink twice if you know what I'm talking about. Right? And so often, and this isn't true, in a way you're lucky because you have a relatively bounded community or communities. You have, with so many of the institutions and the groups I talk to, they're creating things. And I often use churches and synagogues and temples as metaphors to help people understand what it looks like to build a beloved community. But part of what you are choosing is the way we greet each other, what we decide who and what is holy and sacred, how much of your church is call and response versus top down, how is power shared, who decides what is read each Sunday if it is a Sunday, what time is service, what music is shared from who, how do you decide and share power, what do the congregants decide they should do, who does community announcements, how are they done, who gets to rise in the church and why, how do we baptize people, who gets to choose whether or not they are baptized, do they get to choose themselves or do they have to be looked over and prayed over? All of these questions are the fundamental questions of leadership. It's about culture, it's about power. And the way these decisions are manifested is through gatherings. Oh, that's how we baptize? Oh, that's how we pray? Oh, that's when we eat, right? And so gatherings are a tool to shift or manifest your values and to make people feel like they belong.
One of the goals of the Iron Sharpening Iron program is strengthening leadership identity and sense of agency and authority in one's leadership. And I see some resonance there with your concept of generous authority. So can you share a little bit more about what is generous authority and what does it have to do with gathering?
I love this question. So a lot of people assume gathering is it's sweet. It's a thing we do to welcome babies and to have parties, and it is that. And gathering is about love, and it is about connection. And gathering is also about power. And a huge part of the role of the host is to use their power for the good of the group to help it achieve its purpose. And one of the biggest problems we have in so many of our gatherings and in so many of our institutions is our hosts who abdicate their power, who either think they don't have it, who aren't willing to use it, who pretend that it's not theirs to decide, and it is leading a helmless ship. And so the role of a host is to practice what I call generous authority. And generous authority, again, I'm going to say one more time, is to use your power for the good of the group to help it achieve its purpose. And there's 3 parts of generous authority. First, to help the group connect to the purpose and to each other. But the second is to protect the group from each other. And the third is to temporarily equalize. When President Barack Obama was president, one of the most interesting parts, again, there's so many different ways to use power. One of the ways he read a study that showed that at Harvard Business School, women students were less likely to raise their hands than men. And they actually started hand-raising classes at HBS. And people made fun of it, and it actually shifted the culture. It shifted the norm about who raises hands. And so President Barack Obama, during his press conferences, the last 2 years of his presidency, any press conference, this was many years ago, and it may seem now as demeaning, but he would say, any questions, and I'm gonna go boy, girl, boy, girl. And it would completely shifted the room. He was using his power as a host to temporarily equalize a guest. He did this with his press Corps. He did this at union talks, at a union at the University of Indiana, and it completely, again, temporarily, it's symbolic, but it's also shifting, and it's using his role in that moment to protect the guests. And there's whether it's the chatty, voluntary of a church training on a Saturday, and 12 people come, and they're all excited, and there's one person who kind of keeps on talking, and everyone's annoyed. At some level, when the host isn't saying, hey, either setting ground rules or making a joke, or slightly taking them aside, you're abdicating your power. And similarly, if a congregant is mistreating somebody, and to say, that's not on my watch, it's abdicating your power. And so at some deep level, like the role of a host, and this is true at the highest levels of our country, and is true in our classrooms, is to set the tone, and is to set the norms, and then is to help enforce the norms, and over time, grow the culture, so then people are enforcing it themselves. And the last thing I'll just say is, when you're a host, the first 5% of a gathering is a really important, really sensitive time. That's both new members, so metaphorically, but also in a room. So when you enter in here, and many of you are alumni, you've been part of a program together, so maybe you feel this a little less, but you enter a room, you look around, right? Are these my people? Did I wear the right clothes? Am I a front of the room person or a back of the room person tonight? Can I show my tattoos? Do I hide my tattoos? Do I need to get a tattoo? Who are these people? And the generous host deeply knows that it's in those first 5%, whether it's on Zoom, particularly those of you who are doing anything virtual, that like awkward dead time, that's deeply important time to shift norms, to warm people up, to use the chat box, to help people understand what's it going to be like in here. And that's a skill to learn, but to help and hold people. Get off your phone, stop doing the logistics, enter the room, stand by the door, welcome people, introduce them to each other, because how people feel in the first 5% changes their behavior for the rest of the 95%.
Mm-hmm. You said something I really want to pick up on, of one of the roles in generous authority is to bring people together, but also to protect them from each other in some ways. And we're living at this moment that is highly fraught, and sometimes gatherings can go off the rails when there is conflict. So what is the role of the host with generous authority in conflict? Is there such thing as good controversy, or is part of the role to just let's make sure we don't talk about anything controversial?
Well, let me ask you all a few questions. So first, how many of you consider yourself like a peacemaker, or a smoother over, or someone who people bring problems to and you're able to just kind of really sort it out? Just raise your hands. Okay? And how many of you consider yourself more like troublemakers, pokers, prodders, not afraid? Raise your hand. The real troublemakers are like, I'm not going to raise my hand for this. And how many of you consider yourself both, kind of smoother overs and pokers and prodders? Yeah, raise your hand high. So these are the people, keep them raised for a second, these are the people in my line of work that are disproportionately likely to be part of transformative conversations. Why? Because you're not afraid of a little heat, but you're not in it to burn the house down. And when my parents divorced, when they separated, everyone was shocked because they never fought. And I learned from a young age that human connection is as threatened by unhealthy peace as it is by unhealthy conflict. And so much of healthy cultures are places in which we can water the garden so that we can hold ourselves and our communities healthy heat. And though there are cultures of healthy heat and there's cultures of unhealthy heat, I would say our country right now is going through a culture of unhealthy heat. And we vacillate between unhealthy peace and unhealthy conflict. And so a huge way to begin to discern and to help your congregations and yourself is first to know your own relationship to conflict. I said this earlier, I'm biracial, I'm bicultural, but I'm actually third generation ostrich on both sides, which means when conflict arises in our family, we stick our head in the sand. Nothing to see here, folks. And I've had to learn, I really had to learn heat-holding skills. And I think one of the reasons I'm an effective facilitator is because I have deep empathy for the people in the room who want to flee. I want to flee. And I've trained myself somatically. My hands still get sweaty, my heart palpitates every single time, my mouth gets dry. I've had a lot of therapy, and I somatically, as a facilitator, have a lot of skills to hold the heat. And so it's a learnable set of skills. And you can't hold a community or a conversation deeper than you know how to hold. And so the first level is knowing and training your own set of skills. And if you don't know what your conflict style is, I promise you your direct reports do. Ask them.
So we've got some great questions from our audience here, including one of them. I mean, you just raised this point about this moment in our country, which is highly fraught. So one question is about, is there a way we might better navigate this moment as a country if we thought about democracy as a gathering?
I love this question.
How might that change us?
Democracy is a gathering. And what is up for grabs right now is who is in and who is out and who decides. What does it mean to be American, right? Who belongs? And what does it mean what is the role of what it means to be a man? What is it, a role of what it means to be a woman? What are our relationships to each other? What are our rituals, right? Our fights over our holidays are our fights about identity, right? One of the biggest reckonings that happened in the last 10 years in a town was when the West Virginia, Charleston? Yeah. Charleston's the capital of West Virginia? It's also the capital of South Carolina? Okay. No, Charleston, West Virginia, but that was also a bad moment. Charleston, West Virginia, the mayor, woman, changed the name of the winter parade from the Christmas parade to the winter parade. And people went berserk. She had death threats. The website went down. People went up in arms. It was vicious. And 3 days later, she changed the name back. And at some level, she had tripped over a wire, right? She'd tripped over, it's the music fight. We're tripping over these cultural wires where there's manifestations of like, who are we? What does it mean to be us? To be a multi-faith democracy, does that mean Christians get to have their Christmas parade and we all, as it is in India, whether you're a Christian or not, say Merry Christmas? Or is equality saying Happy Holidays? And in either of those cases, there is loss. And we are having that fight over and over. Juneteenth, right? It is now a federal holiday. Who gets to celebrate Juneteenth? Is this a holiday just for black people, for white people to not? Is 4th of July the white holiday? I certainly hope not, right? If Juneteenth, how do non-black people celebrate Juneteenth? What is the role of non-black people in Juneteenth? These are important conversations, but they're often had through fights. And so democracy absolutely is a gathering, but so often we're able to see the worthy grapples through these instances when we're like, why is everyone losing their, shit, right? Why are we so upset? It's because it is core questions that are being asked in this nation, which is who are we? And who have we been? And who will we become? And who decides?
So it seems to me this issue of inclusion, exclusion, how we define what that means is at the center of many of this. There's a question from the audience about the sense of inclusion is often uncomfortable because some are then and have been excluded from seats at the table. So how do we think about gatherings, even as they have a specific disputable purpose and might practice generous exclusion, are also really about inclusion and bringing people to a seat at the table who haven't had one?
So in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, and particularly systemically, that absolutely needs to happen. And part of when I'm just talking about the tool of gathering, part of what you're raising is this question, how I hear it, is power. And I mentioned earlier my history at Princeton was through this program called Sustained Dialogue. And Sustained Dialogue was a process that was started actually in the post-Soviet states where government, civil servants and very senior government diplomats realized that while governments can write peace treaties, it doesn't necessarily change citizens' relationships to each other. You have to do the stitching. And so they started these programs called Sustained Dialogue to shift citizens' relationships to each other. And they started these on college campuses. And I was one of the first moderators. I was lucky enough to be one of the first moderators at the University of Virginia. And because we launched the day before 9/11, we were very lucky. We were very lucky in terms of interest. And so we started, and every year there would be dozens of dialogue groups. And what that basically meant was 12 to 14 students, diverse students, would commit to meeting over the course of a year, every 2 weeks for 3 hours, to explicitly talk about race. And 10 of those groups was anyone is welcome. The cap was size because of a dialogue. 2 of those groups were technically exclusionary. They were on 2 specific lines. One was a LGBTQ Republican dialogue, and one was a Jewish American, Arab American dialogue. And every 2 weeks, the moderators would meet, and 10 of the groups, the multiracial dialogue groups, were having a lot of challenges. It was really hard to go deep on a conversation. As soon as you would go on the Asian Black dialogue, the Latino community would be, hey, where are we? The conversation was hard to really get deep. The 2 other groups were rocking and rolling. And in part because they had a unique and specific and disputable purpose, and they were willing to say, no, if you are not on one of these lines, which their line, I believe, was the college Republicans, and you had to be part of the club. You have to have a line somewhere. But I'm a Republican, great, join the club, then you can join this group. LGBTQ, it was a relationship between the 2 groups because they had a historically fraught relationship. And because they had this very specific focus that actually over time would deeply help inclusion in the institution, it helped. So I'm really just talking about the level of the gathering. And often you can invert it, right? So often if your gatherings in your community, in your churches, in your congregations have been deeply exclusive, the radical act can be flip it on its head. So I worked with a school right before the pandemic hit. It's a charter school in New York. Their entire purpose is to try to upend both public and independent schools. They are 50% lottery and 50% public housing from within a mile within the radius of their school. And they have these amazing rates of graduation and all the stuff, and yet after 15 years, they still realize that they have a gala every year because everyone else has a gala. And so once a year, they're completely different than the norms of their institution, and they all dress up and they try to find the wealthiest people in the community who don't even go to raise money. And finally, the chair of the board was like, this makes no sense. Why are we having a deeply exclusive night on the night we're supposed to most celebrate our values? And so I worked with them to flip it on its head, and they launched something called the Alag, which is gala backwards. And in Hindi, it means something unique, something different. And they completely reformed that one event to change how and what people were doing, what they wore, what they participated in, who cooked, what they experienced in that evening, and they raised as much money, but they reimagined what the rituals could be, in part to have their gatherings begin to mirror and to lead the values of that place.
Changing gears a bit, sometimes gatherings go off the rails or actually become unhealthy when you have a host who, maybe even a toxic host, who has abdicated their power or misused it in particular ways, in ways that make it unhealthy for the group. So for those who haven't read the book of The Art of Gathering and are participants in those gatherings but aren't the host, do you have any advice for...
I have a great gift for them.
Yeah.
The Art of Gathering book.
Yes.
I mean, I say it kind of tongue in cheek, but actually this is at some level why you write books. This is why you have courses. This is why, it's this beautiful book. If you mean misusing their power, then I think, gatherings also don't solve everything. It's a tool. Right? Gatherings sometimes can create systemic change if it's a bunch of lawyers or it's a bunch of advocates trying to actually change laws. But gatherings are, I want to right-size it. Gatherings are one tool. And sometimes if you have a toxic leader, they should probably be overthrown. Right? You can't gather them out. Maybe they're not skilled. Then get them the skills they need. But if they are abusive, if they are systemically upending the purpose of the place, then they should be removed. And so at some deep level, like Hal Saunders, my mentor, he always said, he would always say, dialogue is a tool. And if you become a salesperson of dialogue, of sustained dialogue, I have failed you. I want you to be a problem solver. And you have a bench of tools, and you look at a community or a need. And some communities don't need more dialogue. They need a soccer team where everyone is playing on the same soccer team. Some communities do not need more dialogue. Their talking is what has actually made them completely stuck. They need a dance party. Right? I had a church who called me up, and they're from North Carolina. Every example I share, I change in ways that I'm allowed to, and I share what I have with permission. And I have permission for this example. Someone called me up, and she said, our church has done a lot of missing of each other. The pandemic had hit, Black Lives Matter have hit. We haven't physically gathered in 3 years, so we literally haven't seen each other. And BLM has unearthed, they're a largely white progressive church in rural North Carolina, has upended our church and has created a lot of fracture and division and fundamental existential crisis as to what does it mean to be a Christian in this country. And she said, no one wants to see each other. No one wants to talk to each other. I can't imagine having a dialogue circle. These people we also kind of forgot how to be together. And she didn't say, like, what we need to do is a dialogue. She looked at the need, and she looked how tired everyone was. And she said, I think we need a party. And people are like, a party? She says, I think we need a party. We need to remember we used to like each other. And it's going to be in the parking lot, not in the church, but not away from the church. And we're going to have the church band, but they're going to play covers. They're not going to play our normal songs. And then she started a WhatsApp group with some of the other staff. And someone jokingly, and there was some tension around the leadership, and someone jokingly said, should we get a dunk tank? And someone else wrote, dunk the deacon, like smiley face. And they thought about what their purpose was, and they said, our purpose is to create shared spectacle in this moment, to create joy, to release some of the heat. So they spent $350 renting a dunk tank, and they had the dunk tank. And I talked to her after, and they threw this party, and it was, it was outside. It was the first time many of them had even been in any context in which there was more than 3 people. They remember they like each other. Their ideas and stories of how terrible each other were sort of changed when they started realizing, oh, I can see your slight handshaking. Oh my gosh, we have the same Rothy shoes. Oh wow, I love that old jacket. I remember that jacket. Oh, these big ideas I had, oh, I can hear him wheezing. And they dunked the deacon. And that's not going to solve all their problems, but it loosens the soil. It helps them realize, oh, there's still desire here. Oh, we still have some good here. It helps them grow life, so then you can then decide what's the next conversation.
Amazing. So Priya, final question. You mentioned in your own upbringing, one of your households was connected to the church. So I'm curious, what did you learn from the church about gathering? And conversely, what do you think the church needs to learn about gathering?
What a beautiful question. I mean, first of all, so much from the church. And I think in part, I said this to you earlier, ask the questions of your heart, because if you've so committed your life to this path, your questions must be really juicy. Trust them, write them down, make them bolder, make them brighter, invite a community to help you answer your questions. And I think both of my parents in different ways have always been seekers. And so because of that, my biological parents, they went to church. We tried Unitarian churches, and I remember once my mother went up and was asked to teach people to meditate. And then I went to I was 6 years old, and I went to the Sunday school afterwards, and people were talking about the weird lady who brought in meditation, and I was like, ooh. And then once my father remarried, he and his wife went on the evangelical path. And the things that I most learned from the church is ritual, and then when I was actually in the University of Virginia, I joined the gospel choir, and it was called Black Voices. And what that meant is for 3 years I went around Black churches in the South and I sang. And the thing I most learned from that experience was the deep, deep power of call and response. And part of what that has taught me so much in every gathering is like gatherings isn't just a call, it's a response. And so every invitation, right, that silly peanut butter and jelly sandwich story invitation, that's a call. And when all 6 women RSVP within 45 minutes, that's a response. And so feeling that like very, very somatically. And I think the other thing is being in churches in which that were apart from the cultures that I was a part of, where they would lay hands and there were all sorts of rituals that, like, you know, if you go like this or you go like this, it's like, what is making them do that? It made me so deeply open and also aware that culture is created. And that the church is a very, very powerful thing. And I think part of what the church can learn from gathering is that it is a tool that can oppress, it is a tool that can harm, and it is also a tool that can free. It is a tool. And it's a tool to be taken seriously. And I think part of what churches can learn about gathering is that it doesn't have to look a certain way. And that the beating, like throbbing center of a artful, energizing gathering is a shared, lived need. And so much, like Art of Gathering is a deeply modern book because traditional communities knew how to gather. They prayed to the same God and they ate the same food and they avoided the same allergens. And if you go to like, it's true, if you go to like southern India and you go to a red thread tying ceremony, everyone starts crying because they know what the red thread means, and they know, and they've seen all of the boys of their last 6 generations do the same thing, and they've seen the photos on the wall. And part of modern gathering is realizing we don't eat and pray necessarily in the same ways, but that when you have a shared need, a shared question, you then actually are able to create a commonality and a sense of belonging in which people are choosing to be there, which is a different type of social contract. And it can be much stronger when you know how to use it. And people people have shared questions. Modern communities that last have shared questions.
And trust your questions.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. What a beautiful conversation.
Thank you so
much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for hosting me. It really is a delight to be here.
Friends, our evening of celebration is not over, and everyone is invited to a champagne reception in the atrium where Priya will be to sign books, and those books are available for sale. So if there's anyone you want to gift The Art of Gathering, now would be a good opportunity to pick one up. I'm going to invite Priya to make her way to the book table, and I've got one more story to share with you about iron sharpening iron, so everyone can stay seated here. But Priya, again, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I love this advice of trust your questions. And that's something those of us who have been here in the seminar all week have been hearing. So one more story we want to share with you is the story of Shelley Satrin and her own experience in iron sharpening iron.
Hold on. You're so on it, friends.
There you go.
Initially, I absorbed all these ideas of what a pastor looked like or what people were telling me that a pastor should be, and then I was trying to put on all of these narratives. And I remember having this very distinct realization of, I can only do this if I can do this as me. Coming into ISI was, how do I continue to find a way to do this as me? The things that we get trained for in seminary are part of what we end up doing, but there's all these other pieces. Oh, I'm the HR department. I need a PR degree. I feel like I need a nonprofit management degree, all these things that you don't have, or even a class or a workshop on, that you're just figuring out how to do along the way. And right away, just because so much common experience, it felt like we developed trust really quickly. And I think we all had a need for this kind of group. Being around other pastors and women who were figuring things out and just forging ahead, it had like the positive rub-off effect of like, we can do this. ISI offered the curriculum were the things that we don't already have the basics for. It was a blessing and a gift to become part of the program because it was exactly what I needed.
Kelly. Shelly, I love your words. We can do this. We can do this, and we are doing it, and you are doing it, and we are doing it together. And we are only just getting started. 5 years in, there is more to do. So if you want to stay engaged with the work of Iron Sharpening Iron, of nominating exceptional women to this program, of making a gift to support scholarships for our next entering class coming in May, of continuing to expand the table for this gathering, which does have, I would say, a specific and disputable purpose. And pick up one of these brochures that's outside. Use the QR code to stay connected with us. And most of all, let's continue the work that we have started and continue the celebration that we have begun, which is just next door in the atrium. So thank you for all that you are doing.